we might go out and ink a contract at 250 grand and know that the retail value of that property was 300. And maybe it was a house that was full of stuff, like a hoarder, or had 4 cars in the backyard. And we would go out, call a service company, get the cars towed out, clear the house out, and start calling investors. And we'd tell them the house was 300. And then they would say, oh, I can probably make it work at 290. But what I was getting was more like a 12 and 13% markup versus just getting like a 3% commission. But It was my deal. So I could just close on it.
What a pleasure to be chatting. So good to see you, brother.
You too, man.
So, Austin, you're doing some awesome things in Denver. Can we talk a little bit about what you're doing and how the market is in Denver? Because everyone asks me about different states, and I'm always like, listen, I can tell you about the Midwest, I can tell you about Illinois, I can tell you about Indiana, but when it comes to other states, I don't know too much. I stay in my lane. So, what's it like? What's it been like the Denver market?
So, Denver has been, I would call it a big time roller coaster. More that the uphill started right around the turn of the recession. And then the downhill has been almost nothing, which has been a little bit unusual. I would say, like, I'm working also in Arizona and California, and have other friends in real estate in places like Nashville and Florida. And really the only market I've seen that compares to Denver is probably Nashville, where it's just been on the uptick. So what's kind of unique about Denver is that prior to me moving to Denver, I moved to Denver in the early 2000s. Older guys in the business would have told you that in the 90s, Denver was always this like flyover city. It was, the city between like Chicago and Phoenix or Southern California. It got forgotten by a lot of large corporations, a lot of large developers. It had lagged for specifically like multifamily development for decades. I mean, when I moved to Denver, there was very few apartment complexes under construction. Like most of the downtown was built up in the 80s and 90s. And then probably from 04 to 08, it got like a little active. And then what happened in the recession was it just boomed. There was about a year where single family starts slowed down because Denver was one of the big markets that was on kind of almost like a lottery system with the national home builders, where if you walked in a sales office, they'd be like, oh, cool, you want to live here? Great. There's 4,000 people in line for our 5,000 starts. So we're going to give you a number and we'll call you. And people would be like, what in the world? Like, you don't have a house to sell me? And they'd be like, no, we do. But there's a bunch of people in line. So take a number. And what was really funny about that was that lasted all through the mortgage business when there was the zero down payments. And, I think a lot of people were in places like, Chicago is a common city that people relocate to Denver. Dallas is a common city. Places like Oklahoma, Ohio, kind of that whole Midwest corridor, the Southeast, and then a ton of people from California. And what was happening was you had like 3 situations. You had the relocators from the West that Denver was inexpensive. You had the relocators from Chicago, New York, upper Northeast that Denver was really inexpensive. And then you had the people from the Midwest and the South that Denver was more expensive, and Dallas. And what was going on was I think like 7 years, we were getting 12, 13,000 incoming residents a month in growth. And it was like explosive. There were counties in Colorado around Denver that were the highest in growth in the US, some of them 5-6 years in a row. But what was really cool was like I got into the business really in about 2007 when everybody told me I was crazy and that, you shouldn't be getting into real estate in a recession, which I almost looked at it as like it was my opportunity to be able to buy in when I had some negotiation power. And as you know, Lawrence, you're in the business. It's like if you're always on kind of like a value add model in real estate, like you can recreate things, whether it's houses or apartments or, doing things like buying duplexes and fourplexes and splitting them up and selling them individually, condo mapping them. And and renovating them. So we did a lot of that. And I first got into business. I was working in corporate America, and what was so funny was I knew a bunch of people in the construction business getting laid off in '08. So it was like a plethora of subcontractors and project managers that all needed work. And so I kind of stuck my toe in, did like a project or two while I had my job, put in a ton of extra hours a week, and was able to always find people that were available that were in the trades or in the project management world to help me so that I could keep my job. What was also really cool about Denver is that, like in '08, when you heard nothing but bad news all over the media from, tons of foreclosures, I mean, they were everywhere in the US, but Denver's foreclosures were relatively low compared to places like Phoenix and Vegas and probably Chicago. But our pricing dropped like at worst, like 15%. But what was unique about that was like if you had like say a home that was worth 250,000, it might have dropped to 200 or 225 and needed a bunch of work. But as you bought it, there were so many people moving in that it was almost like the day you closed, it was worth more because there were starting to be more buyers than supply. And that was like the reoccurring theme for the past 10, 12 years.
Austin,
So
you've been so lucky. You've been so lucky because I know. Well, I know you've been doing, we were both kind of doing, our mutual friend, Trevor, I know you guys were doing a lot of rehabs and I was doing the same thing in Chicago. And I was always so jealous of you because I was like, man, if I was doing the same exact business model in Denver, I'm in a market that's just slowly and steadily appreciating. And the Chicago market does have pockets that appreciate, and overall it's appreciated the last decade, but it's just way slower. So I feel like that reminds me of that equation. Price equals supply and demand. And you have both the shortage of supply because you have such demand, because you have so many people coming to the state. It's such a beautiful state. So you time that really perfectly. You touched on it, but take me back. So you're in your late 20s, you're doing really well at Dupont, making all this money. What made you want to switch? Because a lot of people, I think one of the hardest things, they call it the golden handcuffs. When you're doing well, especially as a young man, you're making money. Why would you ever leave that? So I give you a lot of credit for doing it, but can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I got out of school with a business major and a civil engineering major, and I played soccer when I went to University of Georgia, and a bunch of my friends got out of school and went to the MLS. Like half the guys I grew up playing club soccer with were on the '04 Olympic squad. And I kind of just woke up when I was like my junior year of college and I was like, you know what? I think I'm done with this. And so you can imagine when you go through being an athlete, like I know you competed in jiu-jitsu, you get so focused in it, it becomes like half of your life every hour of the day, that when you change, all of a sudden you're like, wow, I have all this time. I'm not focused on this like I was. And, I still played like club teams and stuff like that, but it was like an hour a week or something. And so I was starting to realize that as I got out of school, I was looking for something that had a lot of challenge. And the unique thing for my degree was that most people in the construction business that got out either had a heavy engineering background and just literally got parked in front of a computer. They became drafters or some kind of designer or some kind of engineer that ran calculations all day for a firm. And when I worked for, I actually did a quick stint for a year and a half with GP, Georgia Pacific, doing commodities trading, and then they moved me into the engineering sales group. And then I was in outside sales like within 5 months, and I got hooked right away. I was like, wow, I didn't learn anything in college. This took me customer facing. All of a sudden, everything a professor told me was like not the real world. So, I felt like it was like a new challenge that kind of filled that void of being an athlete. And I just kept myself very active. It was one of those things where daily I always looked at my calendar, and if my calendar wasn't full, I was hitting the phones, I was making calls, I was wearing out my shoes, going to see people. And everybody was always shocked when they met me because I've always had kind of a younger looking face, that they thought I was like in high school when I was like 27. And I had a job of somebody that most of my peers were in their mid 40s. And so I had a lot of an uphill battle with that outward facing role with customers. But the silver lining to the story was that when I had gotten hired by Dupont and I was running like the Western region sales team for this one of their businesses, I took an approach that was a little different. And most people that went to DuPont started in the plant role as an engineer and they worked their way up. And that's why most of my peers were in their 40s. But everybody always remembers their favorite boss they ever had. My boss at DuPont was, to this day, my favorite boss I've ever had. He always looked for like the people that had some vision and weren't lazy. And obviously he was in a large corporation where that becomes more rare. And so he constantly gave me an opportunity. And what ended up happening was a year or two into it, I ended up getting promoted to Western Regional Sales Manager. So I had 15 guys under me from Denver to California. And I got a pretty preferential commission structure based on growth of my territory. And I took my territory from 13 million to 84 million in 4 years. And so like I was actually making more money than my boss. And, you know, he commended it. He actually would be the guy that would stand in the corner and high five you. And what was really hard was, you know, I got to this point where I like lived below my means. I saved a lot of money. I had a really good corporate job, making almost $250,000 every year in income. I owned a house. It was kind of like, what's next? And I had gotten married and my wife and me were talking, and I think she came more from the family that, you know, you work your way up throughout corporations. Her dad was a partner with Price Waterhouse, so he did really well. But nobody had really been entrepreneurial where they like started from zero in their family. None of her brothers, none of her family, none of her uncles, none of her aunts. And in my family, no one worked for anyone. So my mother owned like a large art store that was like an art supply business that had like 16 employees, 15 employees, depending on what they had going on. It was 10, 15,000 square feet. And she ran that business as a single mom. My dad started a large cabling business back in the 80s when everything was wired. And then he ended up becoming a general contractor for a large bank and built hundreds of projects for them in 5 states and sold his business like 3 weeks before 9/11. So pretty good timing. So I actually was like the only one that had a job other than my cousins. And when I pulled the purse string, it was a weird situation. I had, you know, I always think of like, you know, there's a little bit of destiny out there in the world. And like sometimes you run across people that become friends or acquaintances or whatnot. And all of a sudden there's like this urge either with you or with them to communicate more often. And I had met a couple guys that were like, hey, you know, you ought to consider getting in the real estate business. And I had been thinking about it for probably almost 3 years. And so I was like, all right, cool. I'll tip my toe in. And I did a couple of deals, did some like rehab projects on some homes when Denver was kind of on the uptick. So I luckily, to this date, knock on wood, have not had a loser of a project ever. But I took the same mentality that I did with being an athlete, where I was like, when things created a gap, I was there to fill it. And what I think is unique about that compared to other people that I've worked with in the real estate business is that, as you know, Lawrence, you probably deal with tons of brokers you've had relationships with. They almost like chase a goal and then they move the goalposts, but they sometimes start to lack the effort as they hit a baseline. So like an example would be somebody starts at zero and then they say, oh, if I could just sell $10 million a year worth of properties, like I'd be good. They start selling $10 million a year worth of properties and they now stop doing a lot of the things that got them there. And maybe their business still grows. Maybe it goes to 10 or 12 or 15, but all of a sudden, like they could have been, you know, a 30, 40, $50 million producer, but they stopped making the calls. They stopped being there on a Saturday. They stopped going when their phone rings and making an extra stop to drive and look at a property. And I just made it a pact that I was like, you know what? If I'm going to do this full time, if my phone rings at 4 o'clock, I'm going to be the one that looks at the property at 4:30. And it obviously puts a lot of your time at risk. But if you love what you do, it shouldn't feel like work. Obviously, there's a lot of effort in the construction side of the business that I've always been into.
Two things I just wanted to ask you. So I don't know how well the professional soccer players get in the US. Obviously, in Europe, it's, crazy, crazy money. Were you
Right.
tempted? Were you just burnt out from training when you were young? Or
Yeah,
do you think
no, honestly. So I got out of school in 2002, and three of the guys that I was playing soccer with went to MLS teams. And like at that time, an average earner in the MLS was about 20 to 30,000 a year. And
Jesus.
when I came out of school, like the lowest job I interviewed for was about 50 because I had an engineering degree. So I was looking at it and like now I laugh because I'm like, wow, $20,000 a year difference to try something. But the really high earning soccer players barely broke six figures in America at that point.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't until probably about 5 years after I got out of school in the MLS when David Beckham came. And that was really what changed the MLS. All of a sudden, MLS started building stadiums and not sharing them. And the teams got higher in value. They started having higher ticket sales, and then they started paying players more.
Gotcha.
But at the time, you could get out of college and make $25,000 a year and have to get a job in the summer.
So that's an easy decision to make then. Okay, that makes sense.
For me, it was a non-starter. Yeah.
The other thing, you said something that I really like, and I want to repeat. I know exactly the type of people, and I've got one of my best friends in real estate, and I get a little frustrated because he doesn't do the things exactly what you said. You start off in the business. If you're hungry and you're driven and you're trying to learn everything, you're taking that extra step. And then you get to whatever that it was, 8 million, 10 million, 12 million. You get to that goal. You have a year like that. And then you do get complacent. And that's something that I see time and time again. And you're right. You can even be lucky and just still your business can grow a little bit, but you're just leaving so much on the table. And that's just, it's hard. I see it with myself. I mean, it's a bit different now. I have a young son and I've been doing it a while and I do pretty well for myself. So I don't really have a goal of working open houses on Saturday. But if I was new in the business and I was looking to grow, I would do it. I do other things. I go above and beyond in other ways. But I see that a lot where it's not hard and it's not about intelligence. It's just simply about work ethic. And you mentioned your boss liked the fact you had vision and work ethic when you were at Dupont. And I think that's just, man, work ethic is so easy. It doesn't take really too much intelligence. It just takes a bit of commitment and a bit of consistency. And in anyone in real estate, man, work ethic goes such a long way. So I'm really so glad you brought that up.
Yeah, and consistency was what I saw that just fell off. Like I came from like a very strict corporate background, and like in corporate America, I mean, every company is different, but I mean, a company like DuPont, I mean, it's one of the oldest companies in America. They invented gunpowder, for Christ's sake, and they had an amazing amount of structure. And what I saw the day I walked in a real estate office after I pulled the purse string was I was like, how come it's 8:30 and no one's here?
Yep, exactly.
And, somebody'd roll in at 9. I'd be like, where's everybody at? They're like, oh, yeah, it's like this all the time. Like, there'll probably be some people here. I don't know. Maybe they'll be here this afternoon. Maybe they come around lunchtime and kind of visit for a little bit and I'll go to lunch or whatever. And I was kind of like, okay, cool. All right. And there was one other guy in the office, my friend Ben, that he was always there at 7 and I was always there at 7 to 8 o'clock. And so we would always visit, and naturally, because of that relationship, he was a guy that kind of encouraged me to get in business. He actually saw that I had put in that kind of effort, and he approached me and was like, hey, like being a broker is great, but I'm going to tell you, like, if you can get on the owner side of the business where you're owning the deals that you do, you won't regret it. It's a little riskier and you might have to raise some money and you might have to come up with some money and you might have to borrow a lot because it's a really capital intensive business, as you know. But he taught me a lot of the lessons about like making yourself credit worthy, creating a very, very like upstanding business where you do the right thing all the time. You don't try to like skate out of an inspection item on a sale because you think somebody won't pay attention. You kind of offer a little extra to a buyer to make them more, happy with the transaction. I mean, just anything from like offering to meet them in person, offering them a warranty, and I mean, at the time people were rehabbing houses in Denver. Nobody offered a warranty, but me and Ben did. And so what was unique about that was he offered me the chance to work with them, and after they saw like a month or two of like what I was up to and what I was doing, then they clued me into another side of the business, which was the wholesaling side. And at the time, this business was called Vision Real Estate, Vision Home Buyers, and then there was Dovetail Homes, that was kind of the fix and flip arm. And so they let me start being a buyer and a transaction, manager, seller of these in-house deals. And I saw a huge opportunity where most real estate offices, as you know, people go out and they get their listings, their leads, their buyers from their friends and family, their sphere of influence. Maybe they're very social. They meet people at parties. Hey, I'm a broker. I'd love to help you. And this was a little bit different because they were out marketing, buying off-market deals. We did a lot of wholesaling to other investors. So I actually took that as an opportunity because I was like, wow, I have the chance to get handed a deal to sell. I just have to make the calls and put them together. And so I ended up selling like almost 75 deals that year, my first year as a wholesaler. And then I bought literally one after I sold every three, every time. And then I did a fix and flip.
So awesome. You mentioned earlier, you said you, touch wood, have never had a deal that's lost money. Do you realize how that's a testament to you, but it's also a testament to you being in a pretty good market, because that's unheard of. Totally. So, and I actually, this morning, I wrote a post on my LinkedIn, and I saw a building this morning, and it was they weren't in the business. They were just, I think they were probably doing their first flip. They bought this multi-unit. They had a hard money loan. We looked it up. I think they'd had the loan for 16 months. And as you know, when you get over 12 months with hard money, which is expensive anyway, then you're hit with all these extra penalties, typically after 1 year. And all they had done is they put some framing in, they had put a bit of electrics in, they had no power. There was like half a foot of water in the basement. It was a mess. And obviously they were gonna take a big hit on the property. And I wrote on the post, I said, here's the thing with rehabbing. They're costly lessons, but it's almost like tuition to learn the business. And I don't know I wrote this. I don't know one successful developer that hasn't had a couple of deals or one or two where they've taken a big hit, but they've learned lessons. So I stand corrected because now I do. I've
learned a lot of lessons,
but still to never lose money. To never lose money is awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I think the reason why it's gone that way is that what I was saying earlier about people that, in the real estate business, they hit that goal. They sold 10 million that year, and then they stopped doing all the habits that got them to 10 million. What I saw happening was I saw people doing rehabs at the time. I would say new construction wasn't quite as prevalent until about 2010, 2011, around when I got into it. And what I saw was that these people stopped doing the habits, and they would literally be on the phone with me and they'd be like, what are you doing? I'd be like, I'm over at this house getting all these little knickknack things done so we can go on the market by Friday. And they're like, oh, don't you have somebody to do that? And I'd be like, huh? Yeah, they didn't show up and I'm here doing it. Obviously, you can't scale a business and continue to do that, but I always filled that gap in the beginning. It actually taught me the best lesson, which was that I knew exactly what a bolt cost, what an hour of labor should be paid for, what they should complete in a day, and even if I could work twice as hard as someone I could hire, I still had some kind of expectation of what was reasonable, so that if somebody was ever pulling my leg, I knew it like really fast.
Let me ask you this, Austin. So when you did your very first one, I'm assuming, how did you have any idea of, did you have a GC that managed the whole project? Were you your own GC? I mean, I'm assuming you did. Looking back now with all the stuff you've done since then, you were probably pretty clueless at the time. Yes, you had a good work ethic. You're a smart guy, but in terms of just the very first rehab you did, did you manage the project yourself? How did you know?
I did actually. Yeah, I managed it myself, and luckily for me, I had I did construction management engineering in school, so I knew quite a bit about process. I worked for my father's construction company. I was a concrete foreman. I did steel stud framing. I did masonry when I was in college and high school. So I knew enough about the core and shell of building, but I was pretty clueless when it came to things like plumbing and electrical and mechanical and some finish work. to the point where a subcontractor would come in, and let's just say it's like a drywall contractor, and he'd be like, all right, cool. Yeah, we'll get the job done. I'd be like, hey, just stop for a second. Like, what do you guys do first? And they'd be like, oh, we're going to deliver the drywall. I'd be like, oh, okay, cool. What do you do next? And they'd be like, well, we're going to cut it up and screw it into the walls, and then you're going to call an inspection. Oh, okay. Hey, there's the inspection form. Like, do you remember which inspection I called? And they'd be like, oh, yeah. It's the 105 drywall screw inspection. Oh, okay, cool. What do you do after that? Oh, then we're going to finish it and sand it and clean the house. And then you're going to come look at it and tell us what to do. And I did that with every trade that I didn't fully understand every step they did. Great thing about it is that when you're your own GC, most trades don't have 55 steps. They have 4 or 6 or 9 or 3. So they didn't have to spend like a half a day explaining to me their steps. So I would pick them up really, really fast. And I think that was probably the best lesson I ever learned, bar none, compared to college, being in Dupont, learning. I mean, I could build pivot tables. That didn't do anything for me for learning just the sequence of steps and pertinent to construction. And the thing that I had always heard in the back of my head was my friend Ben at 7 a.m. drinking coffee in the office telling me, oh yeah, you need to be on the owner side of the business. Know the construction sequence, know the construction process, get really, really good at it so there's no curveballs for you. And then you will hit a few roadblocks on things that maybe you think like, oh, this house doesn't need a roof. And then you find out later that it does. But eventually you find that after you've run into that 5, 6, 7 times, you start to account for, well, what does it cost if I have to do a sewer line? What does it cost if I have to replace a roof? What does it cost if every single window needs to be pulled out, reframed, and installed, not just replaced? And then you can account for it. And that was always my, where my corporate background kicked in, because I had so much reporting to do at a company like Dupont that I literally would learn the steps and I would go build a spreadsheet. And my estimating template that I've been working on for, call it 15 years, it used to start out with 13 line items. Now it's like 165. And then I have highlighted ones that I change project specific because, every project has a couple different things. And to me, that was the lessons that I learned. I just learned them where I didn't let people give me their opinion and not explain their process. And that, I think, was huge.
Austin, that's so impressive. And I have a lot more respect for you now, because so many people, when they say I'm going to do a rehab, they just get a GC and they write the checks and they don't really follow a little bit, but they're not so clued in on the process. And for you, by being so measured and you really wanted to learn, you were asking all these people the order. And then, like you said, you have the multiple line spreadsheets, you're keeping track of everything. That's just, again, it comes down to you being, good work ethic, attention to detail. That's really awesome. You mentioned earlier about the wholesaling. So for people, obviously I'm familiar with it, but can you explain a little bit about how that works for people that aren't so familiar with it?
Yeah. So wholesaling is kind of the off-market side of the real estate business. It's really, I would say it's pretty prevalent in most big cities in America, where you got kind of three types of people in real estate. You got the brokers, you got the buyers and sellers, and then you have all the people who might be sellers, but they really don't understand the process. So there's kind of 2 ways I've seen people take wholesaling. There's way one, and everybody in the real estate business has met people like this, where they try to hide information from a potential seller that calls them directly. And it's really just the business of pulling the wool over somebody's eyes. Everybody's heard the old thing about a snake oil salesman, right? Little old lady calls you up and says, hey, Austin, I saw you bought this house next door. Would you be interested in buying my house? The first question I would always ask them is well, why do you want to sell? And they would usually tell me, oh, I'm getting older. I'm going to move in with my daughter. There's always a story, right? And it's well, why haven't you decided to sell your house on the market? Well, my house hasn't been renovated in 50 years. And somebody told me that I might have a hard time. Oh, okay. Who told you that? Oh, my daughter did, my aunt, my uncle, whoever. Great thing about this is that I took an approach right away that I was like, you know what? I never want to be on Nextdoor or a board or have any broker in town saying a bad thing about me. So where I could have pulled the wool over people's eyes and bought houses for 200 instead of 250, I paid people every time the most amount of money I could pay them to make the deal work. And it paid off in the long run because they told other people. And it's part of the way that I was able to scale my business so big was that I don't think I've actually ever bought a project or a rehab that was actively listed other than like 10 out of 300. Because my phone would ring from brokers, from sellers, from relatives of sellers. And I didn't buy them all. There were certainly times where I said, I can't do anything with this transaction. But the other side of the wholesale business is where you go out and you do what's called like assignable contracts. So what we were doing was we sent out a lot of mail. People would call and they'd say like, hey, I have a house to sell. Would you tell me what you'd pay? Similar to like what Zillow was doing when they had the little like iBuyer program where you could like see what your house is worth. They'd make you an instant offer, right? We were doing this in 2008. And people would call and they'd say like, well, what would you pay me for my house? And we'd go look at it. We'd crunch the numbers on what the rehab would cost. Oh, this rehab's probably, $100,000 to $110,000 to get it to like our standards of how we would sell it. Cause we didn't want to cut corners. We didn't want a bad reputation. And, sometimes they worked out where we could buy the house and have a spread. And sometimes we just tell them like, you know what, this isn't going to be for us, but we would still help them. And so what was really cool about that was, instead of just telling someone no and stopping, I mean, there was times where I would send people over to their house and help people move. And you'd be surprised how many times those people called back and said, I really appreciate you. I'm going to sell you my house. I just felt like it was like, do the right thing, whether it pays you now or it pays you later. And what happened was we started having more leads and buying opportunities come in than all of us could buy. And so we networked with a group of like, call it 50 to 60 other investors like us that were always looking to purchase. And we would go out and like tie a house up under contract for 250,000 and run the numbers. And we'd say, hey, XYZ company, this house should probably retail for 380,000. You can buy it for 275. You probably have an $80,000 rehab. And, with interest and everything, you're looking at making, $45,000 in profit in probably 3 to 5 months. And then what we did that was also a little different was most wholesalers stopped there and they didn't help anyone. And they just said, do you want to buy it? Yes or no. Right. So obviously sometimes that was the transaction side of it. But sometimes people would call and be like, well, I want to buy it, but I've never done a rehab. What do I do? And I'd be like, well, do you want a partner? And they'd be like, well, what does that look like? And I was like, have us do the rehab and you buy the property and we'll split the profits with you. And that grew our business exponentially because what started happening was, like you were saying, the guys that are getting the rehab business, they learned the hard way by not finishing projects. We didn't want to see that happen with our transactions. So if we didn't feel like someone was going to be a ready, willing, and able investor that could turn their projects and be another buyer again for us, we stepped in and helped them. And we got paid for it. But they were happy to pay us because they learned the process just like I did. And it actually created about 8 of my 15 investors that have been with me now to where now, I mean, they just write me checks. They're like, you go do it. Here's a check, 250 grand, make us some money. I just always looked at the business as like, how can I turn one opportunity into another? And that was where wholesaling eventually grew into what turned into my permanent business, which is Lux Builders, that drafted into real estate development. And mostly it's been for sale housing. We've done anything from 20, 30 unit townhome projects to bought 5 homes on a block and demoed them all and built new homes to just individual sites. To we're actually like cutting 3 subdivisions right now that are 15, 16 custom homes. And yeah, wholesaling was like always what I read was the best way to enter into the business of being an investor. one of the things a mentor of mine told me was, he was like, hey, don't ever have a business where you only have one plate spinning. And I was like, what do you mean? And he was like, well, if you're a broker, when you don't sell houses, you don't make any money, right? And I'm like, oh yeah, okay. So he's like, you should be a broker, but guess what? Find out the times a day everybody calls you. And I'm like, oh yeah, I guess they always call me when they're not at work. He's like, well, what are you going to do all day when they're at work? And I'm like, well, I guess I could be an investor. And he's like, yeah, so you can get up early. You can go look for deals. You can still communicate with your clients. You can still go out and wholesale deals by making that extra phone call a day, but you're also being an investor. And then you're just doing that extra hour a day where client calls up and says, hey, I want to go out and look at properties. You go meet them at 3:00. You show them properties till 6, or you show them on a Sunday. And I started realizing, I was like, oh, I could almost break my calendar into segments and I could have more than one plate spinning. And he was like, well, once you graduate from being a broker to being a wholesaler, then you graduate to being an investor. Then you graduate to being a property manager where you own buildings. And so I just kind of looked at it as like, I got steps to climb, right? And I'm at the top of the 4th step right now. And that's what I've been working on to go to maybe the 5th step. I think that's probably the number one thing I've seen in the real estate business where people don't continue to innovate. They're like, I'm a great broker, and they stop. They never learn anything new. I'm sure you see that too.
Well, I love what you said about, you were thinking, yes, maybe you scam some poor old lady and you get a great deal, and then you have a bad reputation or you don't have repeat clients. We talked earlier about people that when they get a bit of success, they stop doing the kind of those daily habits, the things that might not be so fun, but that got them the original success, and that kind of limits their growth. What you said is so important. Reputation and integrity in this business is everything. And you weren't thinking about a quick sale or a quick few sales. You were thinking about, how can I have a lifetime of fish? And I just love that, man. That's the biggest mistake I see too, is people try and be greedy. And I always say, I mean, I don't know how many transactions I had last year. It was a lot, but who cares if a couple of them I ended up doing for free just to keep relationships or help people out that were struggling, or whatever the case is. I do that all the time because I don't care. I don't care about one deal, one commission. I'm thinking about longevity, having a long-term time horizon, and repeat business. And I love the fact you said that. And so wholesaling. So I guess I always thought wholesaling is slightly different. I always thought it was when people, they kind of get a discount and they buy a package and then they sell them off separately off market. I guess it's kind of the same thing. But I guess I realized that I've been doing that more and more now, where I'm known in certain areas of Chicago as the guy that works with a lot of developers and rehabbers. And so people bring me projects, the options that never hit the open market. They call me and they say, I've got this, well, what would he pay? And they probably could get more if they listed it. But for what they're about is they want an easy transaction. They want a cash buy. They want to close in 10 days. And they just want, they'll pay a bit of money for the ease. And of course, that's great for my developers because then they're not in bidding wars, especially as inventory is kind of tight now for rehab properties or for good lots or whatever it is. So it's such a good business model.
Let me ask you a question. So when you do that now, do you typically just mark up the property for a standard commission and act like a broker?
No, I get paid as a broker, so I'm not marking it up. It's like
this is where it's different. This is
yes, exactly. Because
so I would go out and say, Billy the seller, I'll pay you $250. Execute an assignable contract, and then I would go call you, Lawrence, and I'd say, hey, Lawrence, I got an investment deal for you. This is what it takes to rehab it. This is what it should retail at. This is what it costs. And they don't know what I'm under contract for.
Exactly.
Now,
yeah.
I make them sign a disclosure that says they know that I'm a for-profit business. And, on average, like what would happen would be like, we might go out and ink a contract at $250,000 and know that the retail value of that property was $300,000. And maybe it was a house that was full of stuff, like a hoarder, or, had 4 cars in the backyard. And we would go out, call a service company, get the cars towed out, clear the house out, and start calling investors. And we'd tell them the house was $300,000. And then they would say, oh, I can probably make it work at $290,000. But what I was getting was more like a 12 and 13% markup versus just getting like a 3% commission. But It was my deal. So I could just close on it. So I didn't have to sell it. And you have to be a little careful because legally you really have to know what you're doing, because when you're licensed and when you are in a state that every state's different, I would tell you, my state is very pro the consumer. So we would make the consumers sign contracts that had 4 different disclosures that said that they know that we might not close on the property. We might assign it to another buyer. We also told them that we would be assigning it for a fee. We didn't disclose the fee. We just told them that we'll be at the closing table on the 12th.
Right.
You're going to get your $250. Now, the flip side of that is, like I was talking about the little old lady, like a lot of people in this business would go out and try to buy that house for $200. And I didn't do that because I wanted to have that repeat business, like you said, like keep catching fish, right? And what happened was when we paid people a little bit more, like say, even if it was $10,000 more than what other people offered them, ironically, they never told you this, but 2 months later, they called and said, hey, I have another property. And so we created this like spiral, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, Austin, I have that other property. You never told me about another property. Yeah. It's the one that I inherited from my mother. What would you give me for that one? And we were doing the right thing. We always closed. And if we didn't assign the contract, we closed on the deal. So that was our big thing too, is that a lot of the wholesalers would just take the term of the contract to try to assign it to another buyer. And if they didn't, they'd call the seller up and say, hey man, I'm sorry, I can't fulfill this contract. But we would close anyway. Yeah. And we would just make it a rehab project. Luckily, we didn't have to do that more than 5 to 10 times because we had a good plethora of people that were always looking. We actually took it a step further when I was saying that we trained people or offered them the right to partner with us. And so our whole goal was that rather than me just be the investor, I wanted to create 10 investors around me that I could train them, make them better. And then I had my buyer pool. I had 5 phone calls to make every time, and they were sold every single time. Other than a few, and then I bought them and I sold them later. It was a great business.
Also, I was talking to a developer yesterday, and he said that's exactly how he got started in the business too, where he would have people that wanted to do it, but they had the money, but they didn't have the knowledge or the teams or the know-how, and they were kind of scared. And he would, exactly like you, he would say, "Listen, I'll show you how to do it, and you provide all the money, and then when all's said and done, we'll split the profit." And that's exactly how he got his start. And it makes sense because what you're doing is you're creating a win-win for everybody. You're using your expertise and your time and your contacts and using their money, and you both do well from it. And I think that's too many people try to, I love that analogy of screwing over the poor old lady, who doesn't know the value of her place. It's like, that's a win-lose scenario. You win, she loses, and your reputation loses in the long term. But it doesn't have to be like that. Yeah, so many times, and what sounds like I liked you, but I like you even more now because I see you have that same, you know what I mean, Austin? You have that same integrity where you don't want to have millions in the bank and look at yourself in the mirror and see a scumbag looking at you because you're ripping off old ladies. You're like, it doesn't have to be that way. You can create win-win scenarios for everybody, and I feel like that's a lot of the time what I do is I'm matching buyers in Dallas or buyers in Boston with a developer, and I'll represent both sides. And I always cut my fee because I want to make it a win-win for everybody. I'm not trying to squeeze every last penny out of the deal. I want to give the developer a good price to work both sides. He'll pass on some of that savings to the buyer. Most of my buyers are repeat buyers anyway, just like you said. And the developers are repeat developers that I'm working with. And it's the same approach. I always have that same approach. So it's really cool talking to you, having that, just you have that same approach to business, because a lot of people don't have that approach. And shout out to my buddy Mo, who owns my real estate company. He was my original mentor, and he had that same approach. He's a great guy, and he was all about relationships and long-term thinking. And I just think it's such a good thing to stress, because there's a lot of people that just don't have that mindset. And in the long arc of a career, you're going to do much better by creating win-win scenarios and having a long-term mindset and thinking about building those relationships.
100%. Yeah. And then the other thing too is that, when I started scaling up and I had, 8 to 12 of these investors, I could have just kept on that path. And what I decided to do, remember the multiple plates spinning, right? Was I actually approached all the ones that were my favorites at first. And I said, hey, I'm thinking about doing something else. Let's sit down and talk about it. Oh, yeah, sure. No problem, man. Anytime. Yeah. When do you want to meet? Oh, let's meet tomorrow. Okay, cool. And they're like, well, what do you want to talk about? I was like, well, you know what? I'm thinking of scaling up. which, as you know, whenever you scale up a business, your existing customer base tends to be a little leery at first. They're like, well, wait a second. Like, if you scale up, are you going to have a bunch of people like me? Like, am I not going to be as important? I was like, no, absolutely not. I was like, here's what people I know that do this do. And so I laid out a whole scenario of another developer that I knew. And I was like, look, this guy, he's a great guy. He goes out and finds a deal. He calls you up and says, this is how much money I need to finance the deal and put in the equity for the down payments towards whatever it was, the acquisition, the construction loans. He spelled out the whole process, but he would fee the deal up. He'd be like, oh, I have to pay the real estate broker, which was his wife. Oh, I have to pay the construction company, which he owned. Oh, we have to do a split. People still made good money, but like on average, what I saw was that, a deal, if you did a deal with him and say you had to invest like $250,000 in that deal and it was like a 2-year cycle, right? Most of those people would end that deal and they would usually have something like a 15% return. So maybe they would make $50,000 or $60,000.
Also, is that 15% annually? So it's 30% total, or 50% over 2 years?
It depends. Like, I would say it was more like 12% annually, maybe 25%, but he would guarantee somebody to make 15. So that would be like 8% a year, roughly.
Gotcha.
But what would happen was he was like, look, I share all the upside with you. If we sell the property for more, if it costs us less to do the project, like you get the same upside. So people like that. But what I saw was that he was marking up the land. He was marking up the construction. He was collecting fees on the back end of like $1 million sales where his wife was the broker at 3%. And so I was like, if this guy scaled a business up and feed the deal on every step they touch, and he has no problem bringing people in, I was like, I wonder what my business would do if I created a much simpler split. I just did a straight 50-50 at cost. I didn't mark up properties. I didn't mark up construction. I listed and sold properties for free. Then the story I told my investors was like, look, I get paid when you get paid. So I need to be there in the finish line. I'm not collecting a fee every step of the way. And they liked that. And the other thing was when I penciled it out, my split paid them more. And actually a lot of other real estate investors that I knew really well were like, why are you doing that? You could easily guarantee them a $70,000 return on 250 and they'd be happy with it. I'd be like, I would rather them make $120,000 and do 5 with me.
Exactly.
And it was not a typical approach. I got criticized by a lot of investors, but I will tell you to this day, I only know 2 of them that have a bigger business than me. And I have like multiple investors that are just like, the checkbook is yours. Go out and make us money. They don't question what I do. They don't call me every week and say, hey, what's going on? Hey, how you doing? Hey, are we still good? They are like, I know you work your butt off. I know you're paying me well. I know you're getting paid when I get paid. And so I created this system where it wasn't like you had to go fight to get the deal and you had to go fight to get through the construction. You had to go fight to sell it. I created this whole process where everybody got paid at the same time. And what was really unique about this was that I'm not going to say I'm the first person that did it, but I didn't know very many people that would let the curtain down and actually show people everything. And one of the things that my oldest investor told me, which I asked him a couple of years ago, we're on like 10 plus years now. I was like, hey, what made you decide to do this? He's like, you know what was crazy was I had done a couple of deals with other people and they would send me a budget and say, hey, we're going to do this project for $1 million in construction. And I didn't see anything until it was time to sell it. He's like, you went out, hired an accountant. You sent me a detailed accounting every month of every expense with a copy of the checks, with a copy of the invoices, and you accounted for it every step of the way. This was kind of where my corporate background came in, because the last thing I wanted was for someone to be out getting coffee on a Friday and be like, oh, I'm going to go drive by that project. And they walk in and talk to the drywaller, and he's like, oh, yeah, no, we're doing good. Yeah, hey, what's your name again? Oh, cool, you're the owner. Oh, nice to meet you. hey, just out of curiosity, how much are you guys charging to do this job? Oh, we're charging 20 grand. And then they go back and look and be like, wonder why I'm not paying 20 grand. That never happened with me ever. Like to the point that people would be like, hey, I found a mistake. I know it's small, but it was like $7. Oh, shoot. Must have made a typo. That was like the worst call I ever got because I just showed everybody everything.
Transparency, brother. That's incredible.
Oh, God. It's the biggest thing in business.
And that's how you built the trust. And that's why they're still with you 10 years later and they have a blank checkbook is because you earned that. That's amazing. So one thing I've noticed with developers is even if they do great work, there's very few that are very, anal about keeping good records, being really responsive when you call them. And so when you do that stuff, it kind of sets you apart. Just like with real estate, if I had a new agent call me and they wanted some advice, the first thing I'd say is just be okay. Be like average, a little bit better than average, because the bar is so fucking low. And there's just so much mediocrity and people that don't call you back that, I even had someone, I had someone tell me very recently about like, oh my God, you're so responsive. And I was like, I'm actually less responsive than I was before I was a dad, but I'm still 20 times more responsive than half these agents, that just take 3 days to get back to you. It's very, very frustrating. So
yeah.
Communication and then transparency are such big things. Can I ask you, what about things like, so did you give it sounds like they're having an incredible thing with you because you're not trying to mark up everything. Did you give them any type of guarantees like in the beginning or not?
So part of the reason why I did that was I was like, look, if I'm letting the curtain down, we're both in this ride together.
Yes, we're partners.
So that means we share in the gain, we share in the down. I only had one investor who ever kind of struggled to hand me the check when the property sold for a lot more. And he kind of felt like, well, we did deals in the past and we both made 100 grand. Now we're doing a deal and we're both going to make 250. Like, why should I pay you more than if I would have hired a general contractor? I said, I'm not a general contractor. So I was like, I just immediately, like, one of the things I learned in business from my mentor, John, was he was like, look, when you know you do the right thing, be confident in it. And he's like, and be willing to say no.
Yes.
And I actually told this guy, okay, this is our last deal. And to this day, every now and then he reaches out, hey, what's going on? You know, those college morons where they're fishing to see what you got going on. And you're like, yeah, we're busy. We're doing good. Oh, okay, cool, man. It's good to hear from you. But I won't do another deal with that person. And part of the reason is that when I took that mentality of I'm going to pay the most for the properties when I was a wholesaler, I immediately drew a line in the sand and said, I'm not going to be greedy ever. Like, I'm going to look at doing the right thing every day. If one's a home run, one's a grand slam, and one's a double, we're going to go do all of those. We're not going to just only swing for the home runs and be unengaged when they're not. And to me, what I saw when I took that approach I'd actually weeded out all the people that I worked with that were greedy. And several of them, I had conversations with them. I was like, hey, look, let me ask you a question. Like, when you go invest with Goldman Sachs, like, do you call them up when they say it's $5 for every trade and tell them you did 4 that week and it should be $3 a trade? Well, no. Okay. Just making sure. Hey, when you go out and invest in a mutual fund and they tell you that their expenses went from 7% to 8%, do you call them up and say you don't want to be the one to pay the extra percent? And they were like, well, no. And I was like, so why, when I create something that becomes more valuable for you, would you ever ask me to change what our arrangement is? If anything, you should high five me and say, when's the next one? And a couple of people paused, and you could tell the greed was about to come out in their statement, and they paused. And this was like a big turning point for me, because at this point I was already doing 15, 20 of these deals a year, and people were starting to make comments every now and then like, well, this is the one deal I have, but you have 15 or 20. And I'd be like, it doesn't matter. I treat them all exactly like a business. This isn't like a part-time hobby. And when I saw the greed comments come out, I immediately drew a line in the sand. I said, hey, listen, we're not going to be a good fit if you're going to nickel and dime me, because I wouldn't do it to you. And just like you are telling me that it's hard to hand me a check when it's that much more, I'm also in the same position as you. And they were like, no, you're not, because it's my money. And I was like, it's my opportunity, my time. So I tell you what, I told this to two investors. I was like, I tell you what, I would like you to go find two people that do exactly what I do, that create the same amount of transparency, and I will stop what I'm doing and be their investor. And you know how many they found? Zero. And so it was a big turning point because, like, to me, like, the greed thing was a huge deal for me. I knew that if I was going to win, I was going to win over 20 years and not over one deal. And I wanted to weed every single person out that wanted to win on one deal because they weren't my people. It's just like with friends. Like, I'm sure you have good friends that you're like, oh, I love talking to Louie or, whoever it is. But then you talk to somebody else, you're like, yeah, they're my good friend. But, I mean, they're the guy that always doesn't want to pick up the bill at dinner. Or they're the guy that always says, like, oh, yeah, I'll come to your party, and they show up empty handed. And to me, I looked at business the same way. I didn't want the empty handed friends at my party. I didn't want the one that wanted to be picked up all the time, or the one that didn't want to throw in their fair share towards a dinner. Same in business. I just said, you know what? I want people that are fair, not greedy, and want to go out and put their pants on the same way every day, put on two shoes every day, do the right thing every day, go out and be honest, and actually want everyone to be honest around them. And it was a lot of tough conversations when my business grew, but it actually weeded out all the bad people, and it weeded it out really fast, which I think most business owners just say yes a lot, and they don't try to weed people out because they're just like, I just want to grow. I just want to grow. I want to go. I'm going to get on the hamster wheel, keep spinning and spinning. And I'm going to, all of a sudden I got a $20 million business. But if you got a $20 million business full of greedy people, you're going to have a hard road. And I didn't want that. I wanted to have the right stable of people. I treated it like how I would want to be friends with people.
100%. Austin, life is short, and I really want to emphasize this point. And I love what you're saying because we're so aligned in the way we do business. I want friends in my life that I know have my back, and I want people that I do business in life with that we have the same approach to business. And one of the things I love about the intellectual Nabil Ravikant, well, he's a billionaire, I think, from crypto originally, but he says he gets all these opportunities, and he says when someone brings me an opportunity, it's not I don't ask myself, is this going to make wild amounts of money? I say, do I want to see this guy's name pop up on my phone? And do I want to talk to him? Do I want to be around him? Do I want to have dinner with him and his wife? Do I want to spend time with him? Because if the answer is no, I don't care how lucrative the business opportunity is. I don't want to work with him. And I couldn't agree more with that approach. And I'm proud to say, my brother, 3 days ago, I fired one of my clients. He's bought 4 buildings. He's a very wealthy surgeon. And it's every single deal is contentious. And I refer him people, and then he burns bridges. And he was very rude to one of my property managers I referred him to. And I was just, the property manager called and said, hey, I don't think I want to work with this guy. And I said, how come? And he told me what he said to him. And I was so furious. I was driving home. I pulled the car over and I just sent some very aggressive texts to this guy. And then he wasn't apologetic at all. And I said, okay, we're done. Our relationship's over. I blocked his number and I said, that's it. And the property manager fired him. And it's like, I don't care how many more buildings. He's got so much money. I don't care how much more buildings he wants to buy and how good it'll be for my business. Like, I don't want to work with people like that. Life is too short, Austin. And you're like me. We're both married. We've got family. It's like, time is so precious. And it's something that I feel like my younger self, the older I get, the more I just want to set the boundaries in life. And then if people don't want to accept those boundaries, I don't want anything to do with them. And so I just love the fact you said that, because it's kind of, that happened a few days ago. So it's kind of top of mind is I'm a hustler. And a lot of the time I work with difficult people. Like if I'm selling a building for a developer and I have to work with a difficult buyer, I'll put up with that to help my developer, right? So, but at some point we all have the lines, and you have to be firm with boundaries. So I really love the fact you said that.
Yeah. Well, I know one of the things you mentioned when we were first talking was about scale, that was really something you wanted to touch on. And so this was probably the most challenging thing that I've experienced in my business. A really good friend of mine she was a Coors Brewery is a big corporation in Colorado. And she was chief marketing officer for Coors. She wrote, political speeches for Pete Coors, ran for office, and very, very smart woman. And she started investing with me, and we grew to have a really tight bond. And she called me up one day and was like, hey, I got a book I want you to read. And I was like, I don't really have time to read books. I'd love to read books, but man, I'm a dad. I got 2 kids. I'm working my butt off. I got 12 employees. At the time, I think I had 7. She's like, no, it's this book called Scaling Up. And I started reading it. I was like, this is a tough read. This is not for me. Like, I need the cliff notes. I put it down. I started reading it again. I put it down. I started from the beginning, read the whole thing. And I took a different approach when I read the whole thing. I was like, you know what? Maybe this is the learning opportunity that I haven't done for a few years again. And one of the cool things in this book was it talked about standardizing practices and processes. And it basically like had an example chapter where they were like, a lot of people become entrepreneurs because they run away from corporate America. But as their business scales, they start to realize that they have to scale with it and change their process. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but there was a show on TV for years that was called The Prophet. Did you ever see that show?
Never.
So it was the host was a guy named Marcus Lemonis, and he ended up becoming like the CEO of AutoNation when the guy that owned Blockbuster Video sold it, or he made a bunch of money and he ended up getting in the auto business. And so this guy was running a car dealership for him, helped him scale AutoNation to be like the largest automotive retail network in the US. They bought other businesses. They owned Camping World. And, the guy's a multi-billionaire, and all as an employee. And so his whole show was about scale. Like, he would basically like have a business call him that was failing and say, Marcus, I need your help. Right? I got 4 locations. I don't know what to do. I have turnover. I have bills that exceed my revenue. I'm running on a credit line. I'm taking loans against my house. Like, so he would come in and look at their business and he would just dissect it. And so this book did that in a chapter. And it basically said that, like, don't fight process because you came from corporate America now that you're an entrepreneur. And one of the key points it made was that it was like, there is no corporation in America or in the world that doesn't have process, because they never got big. And so for me, this was a big struggle because I had process where I was always accountable for it, but I had to create a process where I had a way of tracking others to be accountable for it. And this is where the scale part comes in. So you can imagine, like, I'm Austin, I'm a developer, I'm doing 10, 12 projects a year. I could do 8 of them by myself. But now I introduce an employee. So now we're splitting the load. I'm doing 5, he's doing 5. Then I bring in an accountant. Now we're doing 6 and I'm doing 6. Then I bring in another PM and now I'm doing 3 and he's doing 5 and the other's doing 5. And about that point was where I was like, oh, this is kind of hard. My first employee, he's awesome. He's like my brother. He does it like I do it. I trained him. He wants to do good. He wants me to be successful, so he's more successful. My next employee, he's kind of clocking in, clocking out. My accountant, she's kind of like, okay. So I went through another accountant, finally found a good one that had the same work ethic as me. And, I hired another project manager. I was up to 4. And this was when I started standardizing invoicing processing, standardizing how we did bank loans, how we did acquisitions, how we wrote up pro formas. I had a standardized process for how I tracked schedule. And I wasn't good at it for like 3 years. I was like, okay, I have to spend a lot of time with Billy over here, but Dan over here, he's good. So I'm just going to let him go. And then what I realized was I was like, I made Billy better and Dan didn't get any better. How do I make Dan better? Oh, I have to have a process that's similar for Billy and similar for Dan, so I can say the same thing to both of them. And when I got better at it, all of a sudden, with the same amount of effort, I could have 5 people doing that position. And then I got even bigger, and then I created a layer between me and them, which was like an operations manager. And I trained him how to be me. That was a huge learning curve where you essentially say, I'm not going to do the day-to-day in my business. I have a layer between me and the field and construction, and that person has to do the part that I did. So then it freed my time up to grow the business and take on extra investors, extra projects. I learned how to do multifamily development, and I started going from just building a house or two on a lot to building 15 on a project. That was a huge learning curve. Everything was multiplied by 15, 15 bills for every one trade, 25 bills for every two trades. Just that alone it was mind boggling the first time. But what was funny is that, you always hear like athletes or like coaches or trainers, they always talk about like no one was ever good the first time they did it. They had to keep doing it, keep the repetition, keep the commitment, keep showing up, keep making the extra phone call, keep making the extra time to find the way to streamline your process. So I'm pleased to say now that after like 10 years of doing this, there's very few things that come up in a weekly or monthly basis that I haven't seen, haven't already figured out, haven't already had a process. And I probably have it documented to where I don't have to drive to the property. Someone can send me a picture and I'm like, oh, yep, let me send you how to measure for that. Here's what you do. Here's the standard measurements. Here's how you install it. Okay, great. Call me when it's done. I'm going to come inspect it this time. They do it. Oh man, I'm sorry, Andrew. This isn't quite right. Remember what I told you? 32-inch spacing, 29-inch height. Then you hang a mirror. Now you have sconces that are evenly spaced. Look at what you did. They're not evenly spaced. Oh man, you know what? I probably should have wrote it on the wall. Yeah. Guess what? Now he writes it on the wall and he doesn't do it. So it's little examples like that if you just become the fixer, you'll never scale, ever. Like you could never be in 12 places at once. Like right now I have like 35 projects in construction and every one of my PMs manages about 5. And could you imagine how many phone calls I would get a day if I had no process? I mean,
Same.
Literally, I get almost 0 calls now. It's like, I sometimes call everybody. I'm like, hey, are you good? Are you doing all right? And they're like, oh yeah, I'm good. I'm good. When do you want to come meet? Oh yeah, let's do it on Thursday. And when I walk through, I'm like, I always find something that I'm picky about because I have like a really keen eye. Like I'm sure all my PMs would call me eagle eye behind my back. But, I always tell them, I'm like, would you rather me tell you now or tell you when there's a big lift at the end? And I think they've grown to realize that like, it is good to have that structure and that process. It makes their day a little easier. It makes them not feel overwhelmed as often. And because construction's difficult, it's long duration. It's funny. Like I'm sure you've had conversations with friends where they're like, "Hey, tell me about your business." And I will never forget the time someone told me, like, "I can't believe a transaction with you can take a year or two." I'm like, "Oh yeah, like 20 to 27 months," and they're like, "All of them?" And I'm like, "All of them," and I'm like, "Really?" And I'm like, "Yeah." They're like, I don't think my business has ever had a transaction that takes more than 2 days. And I'm like, yeah, imagine the amount of detail when you work on something every day for 2 years. It's a little step every day. Stay on the process, stay on the track. It's just like becoming physically fit. It's just like changing something in your life. You can't win overnight. It takes months, it takes years sometimes. But, scaling was a really cool challenge. It was probably like the most recent thing that I went through that made me think of like athletics again, where, I remember going to like physical conditioning and they were like, okay, so here's what we're going to do today. You're going to run quarters. And I'm like, cool. So is it 4? And they're like, no, you're going to do 17. Oh, that's a lot of running. And they're like, then we're going to go run hills. Oh, okay. So is that like 2? And they're like, no, there's going to be 15. Oh, but by the end of the month, you're going to be doing these kinds of times, these kinds of mile times, these kinds of start and stop sprints, and you'll get there. But you got to do the 15 every day. You got to do the 17 every day. And this was like super relatable to that. But the problem was, as you know, when you get into this and you scale anything up, it's not like you got the little guy on your shoulder saying, oh, hey, Lawrence, did you forget to make that other call today? Oh, hey, Lawrence, did you send those 3 emails that you always send when you hit this phase? Oh, shoot. Yeah, you're right. So I had to create like checks and balances for all that stuff. And it really actually kind of made me actually love having a business, because I was like, this is a real business. This is not just a dude with a truck who builds houses that makes money. This is a business. And I think a lot of people, when they become an entrepreneur, they think a lot about me, a lot about and oh man, I'll tell you, like a coach that I had in high school, you know, the shirts that say big team, little me, he would take those and just tear them off. And he'd be like, if all you do is think about yourself and, you know, there's no I in team, he's like, you're just like everybody else. He's like, I want you to be the T, the E, the A, and the M, because you have to be there for your team. You have to be physically present, mentally present. You have to be emotionally present. You have to be, you have to do the work. You have to make the reps. He's like, it's hard. If you're not willing for it to be hard, you're probably not my player. And at the time I thought he was a jerk. And now I look back and I'm like, holy cow, this guy taught me the best lesson ever. He was like, it's not about me. It's not about just being one cog in the wheel on the team. It's about everybody being pushing and actually doing like what Michael Jordan used to do, and looking over at his teammate and being like, hey, why aren't you running with everybody? Why aren't you keeping up? I'm keeping up. You keep up. And it was, that was kind of like the scaling aspect, right? Like I would look at my teammate and I'd be like, hey man, make those 3 calls. You know, you're supposed to do it. It's in our schedule. You got reminded. It was in your weekly update last week. This is what you told the owner you were going to do. Oh yeah, you're right. I'll do it right now. And I'd be like, it's all good. We all do this. I'm here on your team. I'm here to remind you just like you remind me. And that's what I think like has really helped me with not having a lot of turnover too, was that I've always shown everybody that I'm willing to do the reps, you know, like when they were tired, when they didn't want to do the reps, I would do the reps, and they would see me do it. They'd be like, oh crap, he did it too. I got to do this. And I think that's something a lot of people lose sight of, is they get to be like a CEO or a president, or they make $1 million a year and they're like, I don't call those people anymore. You know, you'd be surprised when you pick up the phone how quick things happen. Hey, it's Austin. Oh, hey, Austin. What's going on? Well, I'm calling you because of this. Oh, yeah, no problem. I'll get right on it. Yeah. Okay, cool. I'll call your guy back and I'll let him know. And it's just about doing reps. And it's like, you can't hide from it. You can't run from it. You just got to do it.
Having processes and systems is that I've had that conversation with so many agents who they're kind of slower. 2023 was a slower year for a lot of people. I think half the agents in Illinois did either 1 or 0 deals in 2023. So a lot of people are like, man, you know, I think it's going to be a crazy, and that's my next question, is where you see 2024, but I think we're going to be very, very busy. But I've had that conversation with so many people, Austin, where I've said, listen, you have to have the systems and processes in place now when you're slow, so that when you do get busier and life is more hectic and you're losing your mind, you're going to be able to keep track of everything. And I love what you said about that's such a great thing with scaling, is it becomes a bit of a different job in the sense that it's a lot more about making sure you're managing people, you're making sure they're the right fit for the job and that they have the same mindset as you. It's almost like, it reminds me of when I moved here and I had this trading company, and my boss was an incredible trader, made all this money for the company. And then they sent him from England to Chicago to be the manager of the office. But he had 0 people skills, and suddenly he had to manage, 16, 18 people. And he did a horrible job. And after a few months, he was called to the New York office, and they gave a different manager, because he was almost having a breakdown, because he was really good at trading, but his role grew and he couldn't adapt that new growth. So I love what you said about so many entrepreneurs leave corporate America because they want the freedom. But then as their entrepreneurship expands and their business grows and they have more success, they can't just forget about some of the good things about corporate America, which is processes and systems. So that's really, really awesome.
Totally.
Let's talk about 2024, Austin. I know you said you got some maybe controversial views. Where do you see in terms of opportunity, in terms of interest rates, in terms of the market, in terms of geopolitical affairs, in terms of anything the hell you want to talk about? Where do you see 2024?
Yeah, so here's where I kind of buck the system a little bit. I'm sure you know this, Lawrence. You're in real estate. You know what happened to the interest rates. You know, interest rates are on about a reasonable amount right now for what they've been when you look historically for 40 years, right? But it's a sticker shock for a lot of people right now, because we saw very, very low cost to borrow money for a long time. Here's the thing about business. If you get up every day and you work really hard and work really smart, find me one business owner that does the reps that always fails. It's a lot less. So where I get a little controversial on this is like probably once a week my phone rings and it's like, hey, did you see that article I sent you? And I'm like, yeah. And they're like, what'd you think about that? The guy at the Fed saying that, like, he wants to see inflation hit this number and he wants to see this, he wants to see that. And I'm like, listen, dude, if you're trying to guess what the Fed's going to do, you should just stop guessing. Well, yeah, but it's on the news. I'm like, well, first problem is you're watching the news too much. Well, what do you mean? I'm like, you can't watch a business from the outside. Do you think any reporter knows what's going on every single hour in the real estate business? If we're just talking about real estate? And they're like, well, not really. I'm like, do you think any reporter that writes an article is not trying to get you riled up? They're looking for the dirt to tell you because it's a more interesting story. I'm like, well, what do you think is going to happen? I said, I don't think rates are going to change for a little longer than most people are predicting. And they're like, well, that could be a really bad thing. I'm like, it's really only a bad thing if you don't prepare. And they're like, well, how do you, I'm at a loss of words. I don't know how you prepare for that. Okay. So let's think about this. If you've ever known someone who's been a paraplegic, they didn't used to be a paraplegic. And they're like, okay. So they get in a car wreck. They go to the doctor. The doctor says, man, we're so glad you're alive, but you're never going to walk again. And you could take two approaches. You could take the approach of where you're like, I'm never going to walk again. I'm going to cry about it forever. Or you could learn how to live your life. And you could learn how to go to PT. And you could learn how to make the effort. And I'm sure not a lot of paraplegics change their situation 180 degrees, but they learn how to adapt. And I know a few, and I've seen them go through the process to adapt. And it's like mind blowing, like the way they keep their spirits up, the way they put in the reps, the way they constantly look at a way that they can continue to do things and live their life. And where it kind of relates back to like the real estate business in 2024 is like, hey guys, this is the speed bump. You got to prepare for speed bumps. You can't hit them all and pop tires. And if you pop a tire, you got to go fix your tire. So what I think is kind of going to happen, and I've talked to chief credit officers at a bunch of banks that are pretty large. I've been to a couple of the little economic summits that some of the big lenders in our market, one of the banks that I work with is like a $25 billion bank that they put on. And what a lot of the banks always say, and I kind of think of a bank in real estate as like they need to be the smartest guys in the room to be successful because they have to manage cash, right? And cash is king. I don't care what business you're in. I don't care if you sell sandwiches, houses. I don't care if you sell widgets. I don't care if you make anything in the world like machinery. If you have cash, you can weather storms. If you go out and overextend yourself, then you're really worried when you hit a speed bump. And so what I always tell people is the same thing every time. Don't overextend yourself. Also, make sure you put in the reps. What I think is really going to happen in 2024 is I think National Association of Realtors put out some stat that said like 27 million buyers are on the sidelines, right? I think this year is technically the year that real estate is the least affordable per wages since 2006. And you know what happened in 2007, right? We had a meltdown. Well, here's what banks learned from a meltdown. They learned to never give you a loan without putting your own cash in. So since the mortgage meltdown, there's no such thing as a zero money down loan. And I don't know about you, Lawrence, but if someone hands you a t-shirt for free, you might work in your yard in it. You might throw it on the floor. If you go pay $100 for a shirt, you probably hang it up. You probably wash it. You probably try not to stain it. So think about this. If you go out and buy a house and you put $70,000 or $150,000 down, do you think that people are going to walk away from that if they have a choice? And they have a choice. They can go get another job if they get laid off. They can go work 2 jobs if they get laid off. They can go out and find a way. They can go sell the house too. And so what you're seeing is banks are being way more forthcoming to work with people to not enter foreclosure. I think part of the reason is that they know that their loan to value is not as low. I mean, it's lower than it was during the mortgage crisis. If you gave someone a house and said, "Hey, just start paying a payment," and then they find out they lost their job and maybe the house is worth less than what they bought it for. Real estate's a long game. I mean, the days of buying a house and you're going to just double its value for 3 years down the road. I mean, that should have never been the mindset of America. And so now what you're finding is that people are having to be forced to make bigger decisions. Otherwise, they're walking away from massive amounts of equity. And the banks don't want to call notes. So like I do a bunch of larger multifamily, and that business is challenging right now with the way rates are. It's gobbled up cash flow. When loans renew in 5 to 7 years, they're asking for pay downs. All the things I just said. They want you to have cash. They want you to be a good operator. They want you to work with them when things come up that are problematic. And truthfully, I think that's the end of the discussion, honestly. Like, you have to fix your own problems. And I think what's going to change this time is that there's nobody that bought a house in the past 10 years with zero money down. It doesn't exist. Even if you get a state federally funded like grant towards your down payment, you still put 5% down, which was the biggest check anyone ever wrote in their household, typically. And so I think people are more vested. I think you're going to see, as things really, really shake out, which, for a year now, they've been saying, oh, there's going to be this huge default rate. And I think like the office space is going to struggle, not just because of people working from home and COVID. That obviously is like a big factor, but I think the office space is going to struggle because they have to reinvent themselves. And that business has been able to be, one of those businesses where they're like, if you build it and you lease it for market rate, they will come. Well, now what you're seeing is a law firm that used to lease 20,000 square feet now wants 10. So now you need 2 law firms, or you need another type of business, or you need to have mixed use buildings where you have things like an old office building that was all office turns into retail on the bottom. Maybe they build out 2 or 3 floors as a gym. Maybe they have offices on half of it. Maybe they convert the upper half to a hotel. And it's going to be a tough road for that sector. The one thing I personally like multifamily a lot. The one thing I really like about multifamily is at the end of the day, people still need a place to live. Your rate might go from $2,000 a unit to $1,700 a unit. Your rate might go up in a year or two. It might go down in a year or two. But as long as you control your vacancy and you keep cash, then you can keep your loan and keep in good graces with the banks. Because one of the chief credit officers told me, he goes, "You know what we look for in a borrower?" I was like, "What's that?" He's like, "Well, we look for good operators, but we look for people that can fix problems. And the people who walk away and don't want to fix problems, they're not going to be a long-term customer with us." So my personal opinion on 2024 is that we're probably not going to see the rate drops as fast as people want. I do think the bottom is going to probably hit like the low 5% range. Maybe it happens by the election. Maybe it happens closer to it or after it. I don't think we're going to see a 2 or 3% rate probably in our lifetime again. I don't think we'll ever see the Fed go to zero ever. I don't think that'll ever happen. I think they've even hinted at that it would be almost like an economic catastrophe for them to even consider doing it. The only thing that scares me is that when COVID hit, we saw a massive amount of consumer spending. Like I had people call me up going, "Well, we're in a recession." I'm like, "Go to the airport. Tell me we're in a recession." Airports are slammed. Go to a mall. Go to a restaurant. Tell me if you can get a reservation the day of. We're not in the same kind of recession they were in the 20s. We're not in the recessions in the 90s when the dot-com bust hit. We're in a weird state where larger purchases that require financing are going to be a little more problematic for a percentage of Americans. And then I'm a little nervous about the consumer debt. I think the car loan default rate is at an all-time high right now. I think a lot of that has to do with, people were buying cars in COVID and paying over sticker for them and all these crazy things instead of just driving their car one more year. And, you're seeing a lot of credit card debt which credit card debt always has a high rate, but it's obviously a little higher right now than it had been in the past. So my only hope is that the consumer debt doesn't turn into a really big driver towards the long-term debt to where you just have a huge percentage of Americans become broke and not able to fix it. But I think more people will try to fix it because they had to put their hard-earned equity into buying their homes or their buildings. We've been seeing a lot of deals where people bought larger multifamily projects, like complexes that they were going to do value add on and, reposition them, raise rents and try to sell them. And, they had 3-year notes or 5-year notes that are coming up due and they're barely covering the interest with the rent roll. I've been surprised more of those haven't hit, but what we're starting to hear is like the banks, like I got a call from one the other day, the bank, they have a $19 million loan on this deal and the investors all in for about 26 million. So they got about 7 million in equity and they have to pay the note down to 16 to stay in it. And they can't do it. But the bank isn't willing to sell the deal for below their loan amount. Now what's happening is we're saying, hey, we're a buyer at 18. They're like, sorry guys, we're not going below 19 million. But they're like, but what we will do is we know you guys have a good track record. What if we financed the deal for you at a 4% rate? Would you pay us 19 million then? And it starts the conversation back up. So this is what I was talking about. Like you hope the banks are the smartest people in the room because they don't want to default. Costs them way more than losing $1 million to us. But if they can go out and lend money at a below market rate and keep the transaction alive with a better operator who can fix problems, that's what you're going to see happen. But there's not going to be these massive haircuts. They're not going to be like, a $26 million building gets sold for 12. It will in office. It's happening in office for sure because those deals need to be repositioned. And then in single family, my personal opinion is that the amount of transactions is obviously down. Actually, in Denver, it's not down very much. It's actually maybe down like 0.5% from 2020 and 2021. Sales prices are pretty much flat in my market. But what I am seeing is there's more of a willingness on the seller side, if they need to sell, to have the conversations and negotiate a little bit more like traditional real estate was practiced. And so what I think you're starting to see in the market that will hopefully keep everything afloat and fix things is that when somebody wants $1 million for their house and they would have got 1.1 for it in COVID, now they're getting an offer at 925, 950, and they're talking. And that's the way real estate was the whole time I've been in the business. It was always negotiable. Don't be scared to negotiate. Tell people you're a real number and then prove it, close. And I think the more and more that happens, the less likely any of this interest rate talk is really going to become a huge, massive influx that's going to be creating like a huge downward spiral. But you got to stop watching the news.
100% on the news. Well, so right now they're in the kind of mid to high 6s. So if they go to the low 5s by the end of the year, which is kind of, I'm on the same page as you, I think prices are going to be up a little bit, at least in my market too. So, and I love what you said about the loans. I've had people for the last 4 or 5 years talk about, this year we're going to have a massive collapse in real estate prices. And I've always said exactly what you said. I said, you don't have those ninja loans anymore, no income, no jobs. When I bought my first condo in Chicago, it was 2004. I was a young kid. I had no credit history. I just moved from Europe and I managed to buy my condo with almost nothing down. And I remember it being so easy. In my young brain that didn't know anything about real estate, I was a finance guy. I just remember thinking, this seems really, really easy. And then fast forward to last year when I bought the house that we're talking in, where I have, years and years of credit history. I have way more assets. I'm much more established. This was 3 times harder. So, and I had to put a chunk down. So it's so silly for people not to see the difference. And like you said, these banks they're not stupid. They're not going to be setting them. So they did learn some lessons from 2008, 2009, and they're much stricter with their loan terms. So I really am so glad you said that.
Yeah. And I have seen that like probably 20 or 30% of the lenders, they've chosen to not even be involved in certain sectors.
Yes,
they don't want to be in real estate, or they don't want to loan to manufacturing, or they don't want to do development loans or have land loans. they pick a couple. And I'm sure when things improve, they'll be like, oh, we do land loans again. Oh, we loan to manufacturers again. But they've chosen to be like, you know what we're going to do? We're going to loan to operators. We're going to loan to people that we have a core history with. And if they have 1,500, core history, like not employees, but customers, they might call that list to 1,000. And then they're all in for that 1,000. And that's what I've seen. And I'm just glad that I've been part of that 1,000, because I've had a lot of investors call me and be like, hey, what bank are you using? And I'm like, why do you ask? And they're like, well, bank I worked with the past 3 years, like, told me that they're not going to do loans in real estate for me. Which bank is that? Huh, that's weird. They did them for me. And, it's like you said, like, it's about character a little bit. And I think, like, in general, most of the people that have had those questions or called me and asked those things, I would say their character is a little questionable. It hadn't been 100%. It's been a lot, though.
But I've seen exactly the same thing with lending. Like, banks are just getting out of certain loans they don't want to be in certain industries, and being way stricter with the people. So I've seen exactly the same thing. Austin, the last thing I want to ask you, because you're way further along than me in parenting. What are a couple of things as a new parent? If I said to you, Austin, my son just turned 3, can you give me some advice on things you wish you'd known, when you were a new parent that you know now?
Yeah, I was pretty fortunate. I had my first kid when I was 29. He's 13, almost 14 now. My second kid when I was 31. He's almost 12 now. And, when this happened, like, it was like, I'm sure you remember, you have your routine, you go out with your friends, and, you have your work hours that you try to stick to, but you work a little more. And I really kind of sat down with my wife and I was like, hey, look, like, we got to kind of divide our responsibilities up a little bit. Like, on Monday through Friday, like, I need to be focused here on work. But if I do that, I'll give you Saturday and Sunday consistently, and in the evenings. But there might be an evening every now and then where I got to burn the midnight oil and work late and do construction estimates or get back to banks I'm trying to do loans with. And it wasn't fought in my household at all. So I was pretty fortunate for that. And because we divided those roles, like, our whole family did better. Like, my wife really became a good mother. She's done a great job raising our kids. My kids are the type of kids, you can ask Trevor or any of our friends that have met them, like, they walk up, they look you in the eye and they're like, what's your name? And you're like, Lawrence. And they're like, Lawrence, nice to meet you. They say, like, what do you like to do? Like, they engage with people. They look them in the eye. They talk to people like almost like they're little adults, But I would tell you that, like, I feel like when my kids were like a minimum age of about 6, it got a lot easier. The late nights, the sleepless nights, the crying, the sicknesses, it all starts to, like, go down and minimize, and you start to be like getting to really see their personalities poke out, and, they start to have lots of interests. And usually they're, I have 2 boys, so they're usually very interested in, like, things that their dad's doing. And, both of my kids are totally different. I got the one kid who's, like, read every Harry Potter book by the time he was 6. And he's literally, like, solving Rubik's Cubes in 15 seconds and has a timer, and he has 9 of them. And he's got Rubik's Cubes that I couldn't even try to even get half of them right. And then I got the other kid who is, like, a complete individual sport athlete. Of course, I pushed him to try to play soccer, and he just, like, crushes skiing. He crushes running. It's so funny because he's way less sure of himself. But I will never forget this. Like, 5th grade, they were like, hey, we do a fun run at the school. And, everybody runs in it. And of course he was like, well, what do you mean everybody runs in it? Like, I run, but I've never, like, ran. And they were like, no, it's for fun. Like, you go lap around the field and we run through the little neighborhood and we come back and it's like a mile, and, everybody gets a medal and it's really fun. And, like, obviously somebody wins and then they get, like, a lunch out with the teacher. And my kid's sitting here going, dude, I don't know how to run. What do you mean? And he goes out as a third grader or fourth grader and beats every kid in the school. And like the parents are like, hey, you got to get Sully in cross country. Like he is like a natural. And all of a sudden I saw his confidence boost up. Right. And it was really cool because he like came home. He was like, Dad, guess what? And I was like, what? And he's like, I won the fun run. I was like, what do you mean you won? He's like, I came in first place. I was like, the whole school? Yeah. He's like, and they want me to run cross country with a bunch of the kids. And I was like, okay, well, do you want to do it? And he's like, well, I don't know. That's why I wanted to ask you. And he got all unsure of himself. And I'm like, you just beat everybody in the school. Go try it. And it turned into this spiral where he ran cross country for 3 years. And then he like got really into swimming and got really fast at that. And then when he got, to be like 6 or 7, skiing is kind of like you just make your way down the mountain. And my kid always had this thing where he loves to ski with adults. And he's like, oh, I want to see how everybody turns and what they do and all this and that. And I mean, my kid's 13 and he just bombs ski hills. I mean, he's 90 miles an hour all the time. And he's so sure of himself. And it was just really cool to see that like change in his confidence level. Now he's in middle school. So now there's a lot of insecurities with girls and your haircut and like, how clean his Jordans are and how he dresses. And hey, Dad, will you take me shopping? I don't want Mom to take me. And that's been kind of fun. It's like you always develop these habits with your kids. Like, oh yeah, we're going to go out and mountain bike, or he's going to come go on a car ride in my sports car, or he wants me to take him shopping or go to his basketball game. And my other kid he's hilarious. Like, Lawrence, I kid you not. I hope that you get the first kid because the second kid is very smart and he knows it and he'll let you know he knows it. And like when he decides to do something, he's like on YouTube and he learns how to like solve a Rubik's Cube in 15 seconds. And then he starts like watching a TV show. Like he got into The Simpsons. And as you know, The Simpsons has been on for like 30 something years. He's seen every Simpsons episode. He can quote everything. Like he's probably seen some of them twice. And he's got this really quirky, like smart aleck personality, but he's a really good kid. Like, sometimes we have to kind of bring him down to reality and like tell him like, hey buddy, like you need to be nice to people. You need to be like, treat everybody like they're your friend. Like you don't need to be rude to this kid because you're friends with this kid. And I would say like for me as a dad, like probably 2 things I regret and 2 things that I feel like have been really rewarding. And it's like, one of the 2 things I really regret is that I was obviously building a business. So there were a lot of times where I had to divide and spend a lot of time on my business. And that pulled me away from my family. And early on when my kids were small, I feel like a lot of people told me like dads sometimes connect with their kids when they get a little bigger and a little more of a personality than when they're babies. That was true for me. It made me like reevaluate. And I was like, man, I am not present enough. And I made a big change to structure what my work week looked like because it was just all over the place. So that's one regret that I had. The other regret that I had was that, when you have kind of like a situation like us where you have a dad that works, a mom that stays home, I saw like certain relationships with my kids and their mom really grow a little stronger than they did with me originally. And I was like, man, I got to work at this. Like, I got to change this. Like I'm their dad. Like I need to be present. And I was a kid of a broken household where my parents were divorced by the time I was in 2nd grade. And I really haven't had hardly any relationship with my father. And I told myself a long time ago that would never be me. And so I had to change that too. And so now I have like a very good relationship with my kids where when I come in, they want to tell me about what they did that day and the new thing they learned. And I'm also the homework fixer, like they've learned like, hey, don't go to mom with math homework, go to dad, which is fine. And then 2 of the things that I feel like that were just great that I just hope that I never lose sight of is that like, it's funny because I remember people telling me that, hey, it's really great to be going out and crushing business, but don't forget, it doesn't matter how much money you make, you're only going to remember all the good experiences you had. And I didn't really know what that was when I was like 25 because I was like, what are they talking about? Like, you can't have experiences if you don't have money. can't have all these unique things that you get to do with your family or your kids or, life experiences if you're not able to pay for them. So I didn't connect. But as I got a little older and like realized that like, maybe I didn't have to go 110 miles an hour 7 days a week. I could do it 5. It opened up the chance for us to go do those experiences. And like, during COVID, we took our kids to like 7 national parks. And it was just awesome because it was like, you go to a beach trip at a big resort or something like that. You're running around doing this pool, going to dinner, jumping on a boat. Those are all fun, but you're like busy and running around and there's a lot of people around you and the beaches are crowded and you're in an airport. Well, you go to a national park and it's like you and your kids and your wife in a forest, and like you learn a lot about each other when you spend 4 hours on a trail in Glacier, or you go to Yosemite and you see geysers and clay pots and just these unique things in nature that not everybody gets to see. And I've really learned to embrace experiences and not play on my phone and really be present and try to like be the one in the household that encourages it and wants my kids to experience it. And it's probably the coolest thing ever is when I came home and my kid literally was like, "Hey Dad, I got a book and it's about national parks. You know how we went to 2 of them? I picked the next 5." And I was like, "Cool, tell me about them." And he craved the experiences too. And I really like, I'm so glad that like went over well and like became like something that our family really connected with. And then the other big thing is that, I think it's very easy when you're raising kids to like kind of lose some of the relationship with your wife because there's so many things going on. I mean, there's pickups, there's drop-offs, there's soccer practice, there's swimming practice, there's work, there's a dinner with friends, there's a party, there's cleanup around the house. Like all of a sudden you go through a whole week and you're like, I don't think I said 10 words to my wife about how she's doing. And so during COVID, I was probably one of the only people that I knew that really grew their business a lot and worked every day and like really focused on balancing like my schedule, but making sure I have all the time to get my business in order. Cause I was honestly worried, like, what if I can't go to work, which obviously affected a lot of Americans and it's super sad. I mean, I've seen friends of ours that owned restaurants that like were doing great and they worked their butt off and they lost everything. And it's honestly just a complete tragedy. And for me, like, I was like, I need to pay attention to mama. You know what I mean? And for me, like, I almost had to teach myself how to do it again because we had been so entrenched in like raising our kids. And it was kind of hard. I'm not going to lie. Like you get in this zone and you're doing this, she's doing this, your kids are doing this, you meet in the middle. It's a lot of like turmoil and stuff going on and transactions and trips and activities. And so I learned how to like really hit the pause button. And one thing I started doing was I started doing like a date night again, because that didn't happen a lot when we had the little kids. It just wasn't in the cards sometimes. And then I started doing like things where I was like, oh, you know what? My wife would prefer if I set things up. So I started setting the things up. I made the effort. And lo and behold, just like in business, when I made the effort, everything started improving again and the connection got better. And like now I feel like it's back to like what it had been. And, I'm sure people that have like lost the effort, and I felt like it was one thing that I just am really thankful that I woke up and put the effort back in.
I love that. I've had that conversation with so many people. It doesn't matter how compatible you are with your significant other. If you don't keep putting the effort in, it's going to fade. You have to, it's like everything. When I was young, I thought I could get something, tick a box and be done with it. But look at fitness. You can spend, 42 years working out every single day. And then if you have 3 months off, you're going to lose a lot of it, and that's just a sad reality of the day is you have to, and it's a reality, but I don't think it's sad. I think it's just something you have to build in your routines. I try and do a hard thing every day. I try and get a workout in every day. And I try and have, even if it's just a few minutes, because exactly like you said, you're juggling so many things, your teammates, you're trying to divide and conquer, but just take a few minutes to really be present with each other. And that's I think the biggest challenge for entrepreneurs that I've seen, Austin, is these things. Like this was so nice that I turned this phone off for 2 hours while we've been talking. And it's one of the things that I love about this podcast is just being present and having these long conversations. And it's something that I really, we both keep each other accountable. Like we try and leave the phones in the other room and just talk sometimes for 30 minutes to an hour and just really connect. And it's not
Is that
easy.
what you've done?
Yeah, that's one of my big, and normally it's late at night when my son's asleep and we just talk. And it's not every day, but we'll have these long conversations about hopes and dreams and fears and goals and just get on the same page with things. And I know exactly what you said when you say, you can kind of lose track of that when you got so many moving parts. And then the easiest thing to go is that it's I think Stephen Covey said in his book, he said, so many times you're putting urgent things that aren't as important before things that aren't as urgent, but they're way more important. And that's a perfect example of it. It's, it's not urgent that we connect with our wives, but it's the most important thing we do. So it's easy to put it off till tomorrow. I'll do it next week. And it's like, no, you have to prioritize things that are not urgent, but they're important. So I really love that.
I hadn't heard that before. I like that.
And honestly,
things that are not as important.
Exactly. Not because like an annoying client that's calling you 17 times in an hour, but it's about nonsense, that's something that's urgent, but it's not really important, so it's easy to do that first because you just want it to stop calling you. So it's trying to balance that. I found it's been really helpful. But the one thing, just talking to you, Austin, I'm very impressed. I love the fact that you and I are so aligned in the way we do business. But there's a book by Stephen Pressfield called Turning Pro. And it talks about if you want success in anything, you have to be professional. And that's one thing you see so many amateurs in real estate in every level. And one thing I love about you, and I strive for the same thing, is we're professionals. And the barrier of entry in real estate is quite low. And there's a lot of people that do it part-time. And that's why you have a lot of amateurs. But in order to exceed in anything, you have to be a professional. And kudos to you for taking that corporate mentality. And that's one of the reasons you've been so successful and layering your business and constantly growing and having great relationships and a long-term vision. It's really awesome. I learned, listen, I'm in the same business as you, and I got reminded of a lot of things, and I learned a few things too. So this has been awesome, brother.
I'll tell you a funny quote my father-in-law told me when I quit corporate America. So my father-in-law is an ultra successful guy. He's one of the 13 partners at Price Waterhouse, right? I mean, he was inking $40 million consulting deals and fees. And he had a whole office that reported to him. He's in the corporate pension for the rest of his life. He made 7 figures for 20 years. He would be like the spokesperson at Price Waterhouse events, like where they wouldn't put the CEO on stage in front of the company. They had Randy Johnson. And he looked at me and he said, "Hey, I don't want you to ever forget this. Even the pros play hurt every day." And I was like, huh? He was like, "Don't be out late at night and not get up." He's like, "I've seen so many guys in my business. They're super talented and they get on these consulting gigs. They fly out of town every week. They go with their team. They go to whatever big company they're working at, for 5 months, and they go out all night, and then they don't want to be at the office until 8:30. And he's like, "I'd be there at 7:30, and I'd beat the client into the office." And he's like, "Then they kept hiring me." You know what I mean? And I literally try to remember that every day. Like, no, Kobe. What did Kobe Bryant in his documentary say? He tore his Achilles tendon, and he kept trying to play until they finally pulled him off the court. He was like, "That's just the difference between a pro and someone who's amateur."
I love that. And talking about Kobe, one of his numbers was 24. It's 2024, brother. It's the year of the Black Mamba. So I really love that.
I know,
it's so
man.
true. It's so true.
Yeah.
But brother, I got to run. But Austin, this has been such a treat, man. I love your approach. And I think I'm going to try and emulate your footsteps, because I'm looking at the next, that's one of my goals in 2024 is expansion and taking it to the next level. And I love what you said about relationships and processes, and just getting people with the same mindset of life and business that you're working with, and cutting, and people that have different approaches. That isn't, everyone, it's not right and wrong. It's just what you want to be around. And I'm determined to be around more and more people that are aligned with me. So I really appreciate you reminding me of that.
Well, and I would tell you, I've listened to quite a few of your podcasts, and you're a good host, and that's not an easy thing to do. It's a new skill to develop. And, I appreciate you inviting me to tell my story.
I appreciate you, brother. Thank you, Austin.